Hey, everybody, welcome to Narrative Live. We're joined today by a very special guest, Dr. Daniel Winterick, who's going to explain to us a little bit about why he feels the current mental state of the president needs a diagnostic check. And we'll get to Daniel in a bit. Hi, Daniel, how are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm really good. Thanks so much for joining us. It's great to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
So, for most of us, and I particularly, and so I'm talking for myself, obviously, the first term has been filled with so many concerning events that it's always been impossible to understand whether Donald Trump is operating basically in societal norms, or is he operating as sort of a free agent in the world without any respect for what is traditional structure or normality in our world. Now, there have been books on the topics of mental health and Donald Trump. There was one that came out 2 years ago that was famously diagnosed him as a narcissistic disorder, someone with with narcissistic personality disorder. Oh, I'm sorry. You know what? I'm going to start all that again. Sorry, guys. I am way too fast there. Daniel, we're going to do it from the top. 1 second. In fact, we'll just go to black here and then we'll start it again. Thanks. Hey there, everybody. Welcome to Narrative Live. We have a really, really special show today as we take a look at the mental state of the President of the United States, Donald Trump, and we'll be breaking some news along the way today as well. For much of his first term, psychologists and commentators have attempted to diagnose Donald Trump with some sort of mental illness. There have been books on the topic at least millions of articles and endless news moments. I've mostly stayed away from this game of trying to diagnose someone that we don't really know, even though we know him so well these days from his daily, nightly addresses from Dear Leader, which seem to take up most of prime time. But I've stayed away from this idea that we can diagnose him or that anyone can diagnose him based on the fact that we can see him on TVs for so long. But over the last few weeks, we've been talking a lot more about COVID-19. We've been talking about his inability and failure to attack this problem on time. And it's beginning to feel like there's something more sinister going on than one of these sort of typical disorders that you might find in your everyday person. And so I reached back to this idea that does he have this narcissistic personality disorder that came up a few years ago, which I'm told is a pretty rare phenomenon in the world and isn't really a diagnosis. So I was really happy when Dr. Daniel Winterick posted something in Psychology Today where he addressed what he said was a shortcoming in some of that earlier diagnosis, because he said Donald Trump is specifically one particular kind of, or at least has one particular kind of disorder. And so I'm not sure I've captured all of that very well, Dr. Daniel Winterick, but hi to you. I did my, tell me what else we need to, yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, this sort of landscape of mental health takes on Donald Trump certainly goes back to that book, like A Dangerous Case of Donald Trump, I think it's called, where I'm not totally sure what the diagnosis is, but definitely all over Twitter, you see narcissistic personality disorder. You also see this construct, malignant narcissism, and sometimes you see dementia. So all of these, I think, they're kind of reaches. Malignant narcissism is not in the DSM, not that makes it worse of a construct.
What
the
is the
DSM is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders. That's sort of like the holy Bible of psychiatry that has a list of all the mental disorders that are considered medical illnesses.
So why isn't it there?
Because there's a lack of empirical support for the construct. I mean, there's, for whatever reason, they never operationally defined it in the same way that they have other personality disorders.
when they reached for that in the book 2 years ago, I know you're not familiar necessarily with the process they went through there. Was that just because they felt it was too narrow, or at least too broad? They needed something very broad in terms of a
Yeah.
definition that they could fit this into.
Yeah, I think they made the whole thing too complex, really. I mean, malignant narcissism also comes from a sort of psychoanalytic conceptual framework, which, is not known for its scientific rigor. Um, so, I think, they did say, this is too narrow. He also has narcissistic personality disorder. But I think the narrowness is actually a strength in that, it provides a more reliable diagnosis that can be verifiable in a way that really you can't really disagree with this diagnosis, in my
So,
opinion.
so your diagnosis, just so everybody's clear, is what?
It's so it's like the formal diagnosis for what's commonly referred to as a psychopath or sociopath,
Right.
and in the DSM that's labeled antisocial personality disorder.
So an antisocial personality disorder is a psychopath, or can it include psychopaths?
It is a psychopath or sociopath, same thing.
And does it include any other kinds of people?
Not really.
Okay. So who are famous examples? I mean, I guess the one that people have reached to the most is
Sure.
Jeffrey Dahmer.
So yes, he would qualify for sure.
So, essentially comparing Donald Trump to Jeffrey Dahmer is a massive event. So if we were to say that about him, he would come back and say you're absolutely insane. Why do you think he still applies to this when Jeffrey Dahmer is, presumably this far on the scale
Right.
of being out there?
Well, I mean, it's a spectrum, a continuum of sort of severity. Most people with antisocial personality disorder are found in prisons, actually. So that obviously ranges from, like drug dealing to murder to Jeffrey Dahmer serial killing,
Right. So
or
where would
Bernie
you?
Madoff or something.
Right. So Bernie Madoff would be a psychopath too.
Yeah, for sure.
So where on that spectrum, if you were to say from 1 to 10, would you put Donald Trump?
Um, I think he's a step below the serial killers, but he's up there.
Right.
So I'd give him an 8, probably, or a
So very,
9.
so very severe.
Yeah.
We watched over the last few weeks. I mean, I've watched with complete, unbelievable, disillusionment about how we've gotten to this state because it seems like we've gotten so numb to what he's done. It's been a progression of things that have just gotten worse and worse and worse. And I think as we've discovered that he didn't do very much around coronavirus and didn't prepare for COVID-19 in the way that he could have, it's become sort of apparent that he's let people die almost
Yeah.
it's just willfully allowing his own citizens to die. That's sort of a whole new level of deceit and unlawfulness.
And
So
reckless disregard for the
yeah,
safety of other people.
yeah. So what do we do about this? He is above the law, beyond anybody else. He's clearly set up a situation where he can't be prosecuted. What happens to someone in a situation like that where we're all victims, really, of his psychopathic behavior, and we can't really do anything?
Yeah. I mean, typically, if it was in an interpersonal context, I would say, get out of that relationship and ignore that person, block them or whatever, cut them out of your life. That's obviously not a possibility, nor is arrest. I mean, I think the exposure that the media gives him, I'm not the first one to say this, obviously, but is a huge problem. Because the more somebody is exposed to a stimulus, the more they're going to like it, no matter if it's heinous or not. And that's the problem.
Is there an element of being having an antisocial personality disorder that includes wanting the limelight, or can it range from being an introvert and not wanting to go out there and
It can
also being
range.
because there are some very
Yeah.
charming people out there who you consider psychopaths. I might have worked with some of them, so you sometimes think, well, how do they make it in the society? How do they succeed, considering they run against the norm so much?
Yeah, I mean, some people consider some CEOs psychopaths, and I don't really buy that so much. I don't think somebody would really get to that position if they were truly antisocial personality disordered, but people would probably disagree with that.
Right.
But the prevalence is like 0.2% to 3% of the population. So this is a very kind of rare disorder. And I think Trump was able to avoid some of the problems that most people with this disorder have, namely arrest, because of his vast wealth that he was born into. And if you have a lot of money, you're able to sort of avoid being arrested for things that maybe someone else would be arrested for.
So when you look at someone like him who was actually born into a crime family, who's got a father that was involved in laundering money for the Genovese family, clearly there was a lot of crime in his upbringing, even if it was white collar crime. Is this something that can be inherited? Can you inherit antisocial personality disorder?
I mean, I think it's both. Yeah, it's partly genetic, it's partly environmental. And that distinction's reflected in the terminology psychopath versus sociopath. So sociopath is people who think it's more environment, and psychopath is people who think it's more genetic.
But the way it looks to everyone is the same, presumably.
Yes, right.
All right. So I want to play you a clip from a couple of weeks ago, and this is sort of when I really started getting worried. Was looking at the press conference or his nightly briefings on coronavirus, and he started talking about the virus, and he started praising the virus. He was talking about it being an absolute genius, and I'd only ever heard him talk about himself as a genius. So take a look at this clip, and let's analyze it afterwards and try to get a feel of what he's talking about here.
This is genius that we're fighting. We're fighting this hidden enemy, which is genius, okay? It's genius. The way it's attacked so many countries at so many different angles. And I mean, you take a look at what's going on. And the greatest doctors in the world, I think they're close, by the way, but they haven't figured it out yet. Look what it's done to some people. I mean, some people it's grabbed, and it's a horrible way to go. You want to know the truth? It's a horrible, and then other people it hardly has an impact on. We talked about it. It's sniffles. It's less. They don't even know they had anything. And some people, I looked at New York this morning, and I look at what's happening and the amount of people that are dying, and dying, violently dying. It's a very tough adversary, but we're going to win, and we're going to win it. We're going to win it very decisively.
I might be reading into that a little bit, but go ahead. Tell me what you think.
Well, I mean, if I were to file that under one of the diagnostic criterion for antisocial personality disorder, it would probably be lack of remorse. Because, I mean, he's practically admiring the disease for how well it kills people.
I think so. Yeah. I mean, I've never actually
that's
heard
pretty
him
obvious, I think.
Yeah. And he's not very good at praising people directly that much, or anything that much, unless it's sort of fake praise. But in this case, he seems to genuinely admire the virus, and it's stunning, really, when you think about how many people as lives it's taken away. And then the flip side of that is the lack of remorse for the victims. He never seems to talk about the victims. There's never a mention of who died, other than facts and sort of feigned remorse. But there's nothing that really feels heartfelt.
There's no emotional expression of remorse.
Yeah. Why does that happen? Is that because he wasn't loved as a child, or what? Why does that happen?
It's a good question. I mean, yeah, usually there's some pretty vicious parenting, not necessarily physical or sexual abuse or neglect, but, certainly like authoritarian sort of parenting that's highly punitive, not a lot of sort of love expressed, and a lot of people modeling, sort of antisocial behavior.
Mm-hmm. Let's take a look at those, I guess you call them categories, or what do you call them?
Diagnostic criteria, or they're symptoms. They're symptoms.
Okay, so let's look at the symptoms of antisocial personality disorder. I don't know if you can see these and run through them. If not, I will. But just a quick overview of them would be great, if you could.
Yeah, sure. So the first one, failure to conform to social norms and unlawful behaviors. I forget the rest of the sentence in the DSM, but it's something like as indicated by recurrently engaging in activities that would be grounds for arrest.
Right.
So not necessarily that somebody was arrested, which I used to think was the criterion, but it's just sort of behavior that would be grounds for arrest, like money laundering or obstruction, or I've seen a lot of nice sort of charts of the Mueller investigation, like listing all these various crimes.
Is it
So in
troubling
my,
to focus something on social norms? Sorry to interrupt you there, but norms are change presumably over times, and we've seen people considered outcasts and outlaws for things that today are acceptable. Is norms a weird standard to try and use?
I mean, I'm okay with it. I think there are like norms that are changeable, and I think a flexible person can see that very different from a norm of sort of respecting the rights of another person.
Right. So this is about rights to a large extent.
Yeah, that's
Okay.
part of the definition. Is like the disorder is a blatant disregard for the rights of another person.
Okay. And then the next part about it is his sort of the lying and deceitfulness, which we know
Yeah,
he does.
deceitfulness as indicated by repeated use of lying. And I always thought this was really bizarre, that use of aliases was specified in the DSM as an indication of deceitfulness.
Right.
And, as you know, he's sort of known for calling into the media using an alias for his own gain. I forget the names that he used, but
It was John something. I can't remember. John
yeah,
Barron or
John
something.
something,
John
John
Barron.
Barron.
Yeah. It's interesting because his entire life has been a bit of a construct. He wasn't ever as rich as he said he was. The Apprentice series was sort of a fake view of what his life would be like. Nothing about that was real. He's was obviously some sort of Russian agent or something through many years, and he hid that a lot. These are probably kind of skills that you want to have if you're going to be an agent for somebody else. But his entire thing has been constructed, and yet we've allowed him as a society to get to be very successful and now rule the world. It seems to
Yeah.
me that those norms may not be so. We may not be opposed to some of those norms if we elect people like this.
Well, I mean, I don't know. The norms are sort of defined as something that would get you arrested if
Right.
you were to violate them. And, I do think most people would probably find that problematic if they were presented with factual information about somebody breaking the law. Although I don't know. I mean, mafia movies are cool. I like them. People may admire people who break the law.
Well, certainly in in Republican circles or in parts of the country where he gets enormous popularity and enormous support, they don't view anything he's done as being wrong. They view that his grand mission, whatever that might be, is worth it for all these these little things that he might have done along the way. I don't think they're little, but they do, and that's what I think we saw reflected in the impeachment process.
Yeah. I mean, he got out ahead of it, just calling it fake and a hoax, and that was really all he needed to do to convince his hardcore supporters to discount anything that anybody else said.
Or they've just discounted it, maybe.
Yeah.
They just accept that he's going to do all these things, and that's okay because he somehow has been billed for them as someone who's going to protect their race. That's my interpretation, at least. And that
Yeah.
seems more important to them.
I think that he definitely traffics in white supremacy, and that is a big appeal to this sort of weird contingent of his base. But I think there's also an appeal of somebody who has antisocial personality disorder. They're often kind of charming, and when you're younger, usually, so the implication is that some of this base of his is sort of emotionally immature or something. But like when you're younger, you kind of look up to somebody who is like a badass, for lack of a better word.
Yeah, I think so. I think society sort of, relishes these people. We put them up on a pedestal because they're able to sort of, they don't feel the resistance that all the rest of us feel from society. So they're able to step out in a way that that most of us wouldn't imagine is possible. And in some ways, that could be an incredible thing to be able to not see any boundaries and achieve greatness beyond anyone's expectation. Yet, as we know now from all of your studies and everybody else, that it could also be incredibly harmful. How do you, as a psychologist, how do you determine whether these criteria, these symptoms, are beneficial or not beneficial, except for the ones that are obvious, sort of, except for the ones where you're breaking the law, let's say that one. But the other ones, sometimes lying might put people ahead, and they could have a good argument for that. Or sometimes, a reckless disregard for safety. Maybe that's not the best example, but you know what I mean. That you just reckless disregard for society.
Find a way to make them adaptive. I
Yeah.
think. But if they call the criteria is like if they result in significant impairment in your emotional, behavioral, or sort of other clinical functioning, basically. So, that presents a problem to diagnosing him with a disorder because he is president. But I mean, I would argue that his probably relationships are impaired by these traits, and that his ability to do his job is obviously impaired by these traits. I mean,
are you born with ASPD, or do you get it when you're older in life?
I think it develops over time. So the trajectory for it is, as a child, actually, you have it very young. So as a child, you have what's called oppositional defiant disorder, ODD. This is actually a requisite for the diagnosis of ASPD. And then so it's just like a kid who is oppositional and defiant and doesn't listen to anybody and is getting out of his chair and sort of a problem. Then as a teenager, they have to have conduct disorder, which is sort of more severe. It's like a disregard for the rules and sort of engaging in cruelty to other people or physical aggressiveness. And he was, sent to military school, I think when he was like 13 by his dad. And this military school is sort of like well known among people his age who grew up in the sort of Long Island area as a school for really bad kids who, had disruptive behaviors. And the rumor I heard was that he punched a teacher. I don't know if that's true.
I've heard that. I've heard rumors like that, and I've certainly heard rumors that he's got a very, very short temper. He's very angry at people. He's obviously very angry sometimes on TV. Is that kind of behavior consistent? That people just losing their temper a lot, and that all makes sense in terms of the diagnosis?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's like an aggressiveness.
Yeah, there's one. Did I get it? I'm sure.
Aggressiveness, irritability.
Yeah. So that obviously is a piece of this. Is there anything else on this list here that you think we need to talk about in terms of key identifiers? And then we can go through a couple of examples you've mentioned, but if there's any others to say that this would be a diagnosis.
Yeah, I mean, so the consistent irresponsibility one.
Yeah, I've obviously made a big mistake here because this is not. I've repeated a couple here. I'll just get off that because I don't know why that happened. The good news is this gets edited into a podcast where nobody notices, and I'll make sure that's corrected. So we'll pretend it didn't happen. So tell me a little bit more about the things that you think. Which of these symptoms Donald Trump has, and then what do you think makes him suitable for this diagnosis?
Sure. Okay. Well, engaging in behavior that would be grounds for arrest. I think he has a history of those behaviors that are pretty well documented historically. Start with money laundering, obstruction of justice. I know lawyers would have probably a longer list.
Right. He's certainly, even when he's flouted the law, he's had agreements with people like Giuliani and others to get out of going to jail. So there's always been this element for him of being able to get around the system as well.
Right.
And that's not, maybe we don't know how bad he has been and how many crimes he's committed just because he's been so crafty about circumventing it.
Yeah, for sure. And has the resources too. So that criteria to me is met. Deceitfulness, like repeated lying. The Washington Post has, I don't know how many lies they have on record, but I think it's in the thousands.
Daniel Dale does a great count of that. It's actually the Toronto Star that does that, and I know the Washington Post also does it. But the Daniel Dale count of lies is tremendous, and it goes on that he lies multiple times a day, multiple times in a sentence sometimes.
Yeah, no, he does. I mean, he probably, most recently he said that we were the best at testing. My dog is like squeaking something.
Oh, is that your dog? I was wondering what that was.
Sorry.
Go look after your dog.
1 sec.
No worries, take down. No problem. It's been one of these days for me. I have had non-stop meetings, and then just the technology has been less than helpful today. But go ahead, tell me a little bit more about the deceitfulness and the.
Well, it's just repeatedly lying for your own gain or conning others for your own gain, and he's sort of Trump University was essentially a huge con that he
Yeah.
orchestrated.
We've all known.
Certainly, lying about the dangerousness of this disease was for his own benefit. You know, every sort of lie he's told has been in the interest of his own, political power.
And he never really accepts responsibility. There's that clip a few weeks ago where they were confronting him on the White House lawn, and he would not, under any circumstances, take responsibility for anything. And by contrast, we watched Governor Cuomo take full responsibility in one of his press conferences this week of everything that happened. And of course, that's a real distinction in how they lead. But it also seems to be a category here for what could make him a perfect patient for this kind of disorder.
Yeah.
And the third thing I think we're diagnosing him as, because you have to get 3 out of 7, if I'm not correctly,
right,
is the impulsivity. Tell us a little bit about that, or the failure to plan ahead.
That one, I actually, I think there's evidence for it. I wouldn't go to that as my third one if I was making an evidential case or something. I mean, the best thing I can think of is sort of just reports that he is making sort of decisions about like taking out Soleimani was supposedly not very planned. Obviously, there's no plan for dealing with COVID.
I mean, that seems to me like a perfect example. I mean, he spent 3 weeks telling everyone he was doing things, or don't worry, at least, and then he suddenly had to turn around very quickly and pretend that he was doing something. And none of this seemed to, not only was that impulsive, but obviously a failure to plan. So he was a little bit of both of those things.
Right.
And go ahead.
Yeah, no. So, but I would probably go to consistent irresponsibility, failure to sustain consistent work, because included in that is also a failure to honor financial responsibilities. And
Right.
I'm pretty sure his record of bankruptcy is pretty well documented. I think he's called himself the, debt king or something.
Yeah, it's so cool. I'm very interested in the fact that you're willing to make this diagnosis about somebody you've never met. I presume you haven't met.
No, I have not.
So-
Well, no, I've never met him.
So why do you feel comfortable to make this based on what you know today?
Well, for one, personality disorders, which this is one of, are different than other mental disorders in that they refer to somebody's long-standing behavior and way of relating to others and way of perceiving the world. And so there's an archival sort of historical record for some people that can be used in determining whether or not someone has a personality disorder. That being said, it's still hard to diagnose other personality disorders if you haven't met the person, because a lot of the symptoms are sort of subjective, internal mental states. I'm not sure what the narcissistic PD one is, but it's probably like, grandiosity or, something else that's a little bit harder to concretely verify. Whereas antisocial personality disorder is unique. People don't really think of it as a normal mental disorder because it really basically refers to the criminal type of personality. And the symptoms are all, I think, fairly verifiable, concrete, and objectively known or not known. Specifically, this sort of engaging in behaviors that would be grounds for arrest, repeated lying, there's a good record of that. The bankruptcies, there's a good record of that. And the reckless disregard for the safety of self or others. That's what we're living right now.
Yeah. It certainly does seem like that. Is there an ethical concern even beyond just knowing, well, this is valid, and this is a diagnosis you can make because you can see everything? Yeah, are there ethical concerns beyond that suggest that people like you shouldn't be diagnosing people?
Sure. In general, I would definitely say you definitely shouldn't diagnose someone without meeting them in person. It's sort of not good practice, but I think, with antisocial personality disorder, it's sort of this exceptional case because of the nature of the symptoms.
And in this case, the public need to know. If you're faced with a situation where we can't really do anything about it, the only thing we can do is probably tell people.
Yeah, exactly. You want to explain what's going on to people. And to me, this is the most parsimonious, solid diagnosis, people can criticize narcissistic personality disorder because it has sort of controversial construct validity, and research support was proposed for removal in the DSM-5, but ultimately stayed. But it's not a good diagnostic category. Every president has narcissistic personality disorder.
Right.
It doesn't really add much.
Right.
But the disregard, the willingness to harm others for the sake of it, for your own gain, is unique to ASPD.
And also, you would think, I mean, in his case, very, very quite smart. I know people like to think of him as not being smart, but in terms of the ability to create something as complicated as this, or even participate in something like this, you have to be pretty crafty to get to be president. Is that typical of people who have ASPD, or is it just an extra piece
a range.
of
some,
him?
Some are, very, stupid and are caught immediately or something. But, at the other end is like Al Capone or something. Yeah. And I think that he is, smarter than some takes give him credit for. I always hear this comment that he's not playing 3D chess or something, but I don't think you need to be able to play 3D chess to be a criminal. You just have to be able to, think a little bit. It's not that, it takes intelligence, but not amazing intelligence. It really takes a willingness to just break the law and hurt others.
I feel like his act, that he does sometimes, where he sort of pretends not to know stuff, is really just an act. I think beyond of that, he's been able to manipulate things to such an extent that he is playing 3D chess in a way. I mean, you can't really, play the media in the way that he has while having all these deals with the business community and all these, corrupt deals with other foreign leaders. That's a lot to keep in play at the same time.
And I thought that during the election, the 2016 election, it was his campaign was like a social psychology textbook. I mean, in terms of appealing to people's biases and that sort of thing.
He does seem to have a cult-like following.
Yeah, for sure.
Is that something consistent with what you're seeing here, or is that something that he's just using to get more power and to further his interest in being a psychopath?
Yeah, I think it's using it to further his interest in being a psychopath. But I think it's, you probably see a lot of cult leaders with antisocial personality disorder. But in addition to that, they have to, have sort of demagogic tendencies and, see that as a way to promote their own interests.
Now, we've seen that even amongst the core people around him in the COVID briefings every night. I look at Mike Pence and all these other people who are so differential to him that it's beyond the norms of our traditions here. But it almost does feel like it's a North Korea kind of dear leader situation. Are they just trapped in a cult, or are they just, it's the only way to survive? What is happening with those people?
Well, it's somewhere in between, I think. Yeah. And it's hard to say for each person, but sort of theoretically, somebody can develop Stockholm syndrome by, hanging out with their captor for long enough. They start to idolize their person who's holding them hostage and sort of, think they're great and want to be like them. And I think that has happened with some people within Trump's inner orbit.
Right, or he fires you, so you have to sort of do it. You mentioned the group, and I look very interestingly at there's been a lot of people who've enabled this situation. It's not just Donald Trump, it's Vladimir Putin, it's a lot of mobsters around the world, it's the Koch brothers, it's the Republican part of at least the Republican Party, or what used to be the Republican Party. These people have all enabled him, and they seem like they're functioning, nice, normal people in society. Is it that the people who've done this enabling are just using someone who has antisocial personality disorder to do this work? Or is there actually a group version of antisocial personality disorder where a group of people can decide we're going to do something that's totally is counter to the norms of society and doesn't respect other people's rights?
That's a good question. I think that there is a group mentality. I wouldn't call it group antisocial personality disorder, but certainly a group chanting "send her back" is breaking the norms of society in a way that disregards the safety of somebody. And this sort of cult-like following or the even other politicians who sort of enable him. And they seem like smart guys that went to good colleges or whatever, have a law degree. It's sort of hard to understand why they would co-sign this psychopath. I think it may have to do with the philosophy of some of the Koch brothers. That sort of, I don't know enough, but I've heard just there's this sort of ruthlessness to their philosophy of politics.
For sure, and they really are just interested in the pursuit of their own, which is a lot of the time, in this case, we've spoken about white supremacists. So when you have the interests of the group versus the interests of the self, as a group, as a society, we sometimes allow people to do things that are illegal because we as a society feel it's necessary or just important to us, whether that be war in a traditional sense. I know it's not illegal, but murdering of people within war, those kinds of things are not acceptable in society otherwise, but we say, hey, it's okay at a time of war. What is that, like, in terms of this disorder? Has there been a group of people in our society that have decided that they're going to break the whole system, and in order to do that, they know they're going to have to flout the law?
I don't know. That's possible. I think that a lot of people who have enabled him, who we are surprised about, are given a financial incentive or some other incentive in one way or another to be sort of tied to Trump's success. And that's sort of part of, psychopathy, is that, you can manipulate people for your own benefit in a way to sort of get what you want, regardless of how they're doing. And how to sort of push their buttons.
He's very deferential to people like Putin, for example. You see them together. His body language is very different than he is at other times. So he doesn't seem to have that sort of, I've got to be, the king. He does, but because he is sort of differential to other people. He doesn't. So in that regard, he does have some sort of response to social structure.
Maybe two people. Or
yeah, just the two people who are giving him this power at this time. Right. We are all victims of this situation. We're all sitting here, unable to do anything and having this impacted upon us. Now, that's a very massive event that's obviously happening to all of the world. That's probably can only be similar to people like Hitler. I mean, there's not that much you can compare this kind of impact around the world that Donald Trump has had. What do we as a society, what do we as individuals do to cope with the trauma of what is going on right now to all of us?
Look, I think it's important to see what's happening clearly, which is that there is, obviously intentional inaction in terms of testing and sort of helping the states, fund a reasonable response to this virus. And that's really disturbing. That's, causing a lot of people to die. And we can just sort of educate ourselves as to what the reality, the stark reality of that this guy is really capable of sort of anything to, further his own interests. That's clear. And I think, if there was, this would qualify for the 25th Amendment. I don't think that would ever happen. But I think it helps just inform the voters to know about this. I mean, I would also say not to watch the briefings and for the media to stop airing them, but that's also a pipe dream, I think.
Well, the briefings themselves sort of feed his hunger for attention. If he didn't have it, do you think he would stop doing all these things? Or, if he didn't have all this glare of lights at him every night at 6 o'clock?
I think he would still be doing the same behavior, but we just wouldn't get a, daily reminder of just how disturbing it is.
I agree that certainly unfiltered and live is very difficult for, as a journalist, you're hearing him lie so much, you're hearing him give so many false facts. And then on top of that, just the way he says things and what he does to people is so, just humiliating and counter to the way we should be treating people, that it does feel to me like we're sort of we're airing something that's almost violent and aggressive, even though it's mostly just people talking. It does feel like it's an affront to who we are every night, and maybe even having a bigger impact than the overall COVID would have in terms of the impact to society. So is there a way to mitigate that for people who are journalists or on TV? What would you say to them? How do you frame some of this when it's live? How do you explain what's going on to the audience in real time?
I mean, in real time, assuming that he's talking in earnest, he's sort of harassing the journalists in a legal sense. I mean, he's verbally sort of attacking them or insulting them in a way that, nobody could get away with in a work environment, obviously. My advice would be, one, get out of there. But if you're going to be there, have a good plan for what you're going to do for interacting with this guy. He's sort of like a real, one of the most skilled sort of salesmen there probably are in the world. And you want to really have a plan to be assertive and to stand up for yourself. I mean, if he starts going off like that, it says to some woman, like, lower your voice, don't just lower your voice, actually talk louder and say, how dare you? I mean,
yeah, it's really distressing. And I'm interested in the way you've described it as harassment, because it really is. And I think just as viewers, we're getting harassed by this onslaught of lies and misinformation, which is not only difficult to take emotionally, but also so confusing for society that we don't know how to act. And that sort of has rendered us immobile. And I'm concerned as we head into the rest of COVID-19 and into the elections here, that we're going to get, like, we're stunned. We just don't have a way to react. And he might win, in November. There's that real possibility that he might win. And then we've got 4 more years of this, which seems like an eternity. And God knows what he can do in those 4 years. It's just a very difficult situation. You can't just turn it off because we're living through it. Protests are one option, but people are reluctant to do it for COVID, for one reason, but also we don't know how unstable he is. And so we're, and the risks are enormous to society, to people's well-being, and to how we survive. And that to me makes the push for a campaign around Joe Biden, or whoever the Democratic Party nominee is. He is the presumed one, but in case something happens along the way, the Joe Biden seems to be a sort of a counterweight to Donald Trump in almost everything, and particularly when you look at his personality here, that there's a lot of hope around the vision that he has for America, but also a lot of concern around the soul of America, and how to repair the soul, which I think was one of his first campaign ads. Maybe his first campaign ad was about he's going to repair the soul of America. And it seems to me like that's almost what we have here, is a sort of, we've all been through a collective trauma, and we need someone, and we need ourselves to push through a lot of hope to get out of this situation. It's about the only thing that's going to make us get through it.
Yeah, I agree. I think Biden does represent that, and he's a good person to represent that sort of healing from trauma and moving on. And, I'm optimistic about the election, but I'm obviously worried. I think you're right. I think we're going to see just this holding pattern of the media continually being sort of abused, and us sort of vicariously feeling that way, unless the reporters sort of get together and strategize as a group about what they're going to do during these briefings.
They sometimes do, and sometimes it's just you got to ask the same question over again if he tries to stop one reporter from asking it. But he does have a way of just sort of dismissing it all. Beyond that, I just feel like as a society, we have to start channeling ourselves into a hopeful place. We're not going to get there unless we, sort of dust ourselves off and get up and start pushing back with a positive message. And I think that's sort of. It's very easy to spend our lives talking about, what a terrible situation we're in. But we also have to tell ourselves that we have to get out of it through positivity and hope.
Yeah, I mean, I think hope is a great message, or hope, a return to not having a psychopath as president.
That works
a good
too.
message. But, also, I think what goes along with being traumatized is sort of anger at the person who's doing that to you.
Right.
And, that there may be somewhat of a cutoff of people feeling defeated. But I think if you can sort of channel that anger into activism in some way, that is also, in addition to hope, a good path.
I think it's a great place to end it, actually. That's, when we think of what you've brought us tonight, which is a very chilling and distressing diagnosis of the President of the United States, it is important to think of ourselves as victims of this event, and that, as you suggest, there are ways that people who have trauma, they're able to get themselves out of that trauma through sort of positive reinforcement, I guess is what you're saying. And that's an important message, I think, to leave people behind, is to take in this anger and to take in some of what he's saying, but not reflect it back at society, rather just turn it into something that's more hopeful come November.
Right.
Anything else you'd want to share tonight before we close about your stepping out and why you've done this at this time?
I'll just say, I've just sort of been shocked at the lack of people sort of identifying antisocial personality disorder as what's going on. Mm-hmm. Someone kind of did before the 2016 election in the Atlantic, but they used the 5-factor model of personality, which is just normal personality traits. But if you were to map that onto personality disorders, it would be antisocial PD. So I think people are afraid of, breaking the Goldwater rule or something like that, which I guess I'm a little worried about.
Right. Oops, I'm sorry.
But,
I didn't realize these things would go. The screen just got weird. Oh, no, sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. Do you want to repeat that answer? I'm sorry about that.
Yeah. What was the question?
There's a question about why you've done this. You've decided to step out.
I'm disturbed, by this precedent. Is really upsetting, and also it's sort of like a prototypical case of antisocial personality disorder. It would be like in a textbook for diagnosing someone, and so the takes that I see on his mental status are either dementia, which we can't say yes or no, or malignant narcissism, which is sort of not accepted by the academic community in general, I think, as a legit construct. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to put forward one that I think there's really no way to argue against it.
I think you're right. I'm not a psychologist, and I wouldn't pretend to be one. But certainly, as you look at the 7 criteria you've identified, it seems clear that if it's only 3 of 7, he probably applies to all of them. But certainly, it's easy to find 3 or 5 of 7 that you can say absolutely, this guy has all these symptoms. And in a situation where we are not able to do anything else right now other than think about what might happen in November, I think that's the only thing we can focus on is channeling all the anger and fear and concern we have into a result in November that brings us something of lasting change in this country. Because ultimately, if it's just going to be a successful election for the Democrats, it's going to have to be an incredibly big one and a big win for them. And I think we're going to see that kind of landslide come November. Daniel Winterick, thank you so much for coming on the show tonight. This will appear in a podcast that will be less full of technical errors in the next few days. So I'll share that with you and everybody else. And I have to tell you, I got stuck in the last few days because I was writing. I write a lot of this stuff on my blog and in a book that I'm writing, and I got stuck on the character a lot because I was like, here we are. If we were in the middle of this narrative, I'd be describing a moment where we have this megalomaniac who's causing mass death around the world, and I was like, this is just not a normal thing. You can't. Every time I was trying to understand why he's doing his work, why he's doing it this way, it's really impossible to understand his motivation, and your work in identifying it this way certainly helps clear a lot of those hurdles. So I want to thank you as well for helping me with that.
Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. We'll have you again on in the future. And don't forget, if you are willing or able, support Narrative's independent journalism by going to patreon.com/narrative. It costs just $5 a month, and we get to do all sorts of good work based on the money you provide us. Thanks for joining us on Narrative, and have a great night.
All right.
Bye-bye.